Let's Talk Native is produced at the LTN Studios on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. We break all the rules for Native media by peeling back the layers of assimilation and indoctrination. No prayers, no buffalo speeches, and no spirituality shows. While this podcast does not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do take a tough look at history, oppression, and our survival. But the real goal here is to bring our people together by breaking down what separates us. So, welcome to Let's Talk Native with John Kane.
Sagal, and welcome to Let's Talk Native. I'm John Kane. I'm your host. I got to ask the question, can we fire the lobbyists yet? I mean, it is literally a $1 billion enterprise or industry, I should say. And now I'm just talking about Native people hiring lawyers and lobbyists and consultants to do one thing: interface with the federal government on our behalf. Well, I take it back. It's more than one thing. They actually refine our message for us because apparently we can't speak for ourselves. So they wordsmith our message, and then they deliver our message to who? Well, I mean, part of the reason I'm asking the question now is if we're going to have somebody like Deb Haaland, who in all likelihood will be confirmed to the Interior Department, and I think there's at least two other Native people who have been appointed to positions within the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and I think another Native person in some other like industry, like or energy or something like that. If there are going to be Native people there in Washington, do we as Native people have to have professional white people craft our message for us and then deliver that message for us as well? We can't talk directly to Native people? And I'm asking this question. I've never been a fan of lobbyists. I just think it's a huge waste of money, especially if you look at the idea of results. I mean, these guys market themselves as the price you pay for access. For one thing, I've always viewed lobbyists as having one function: to hold the door for us. If that's what they really can do, is grant us access, then they should grant us access. They, open the door and we'll walk through and then we'll speak for ourselves. I think we are quite capable. Look, we aren't speaking pidgin English. We know what our issues are. And frankly, by the time, these PR experts and these policy experts and these lobbyists take our message, and from the moment that we tell them how we view things, and they take it to Washington, the message has changed. They've already whitewashed the whole thing. They've softened every aspect of our message that relates to sovereignty and control over our own lands. They turn us into these submissive fools that are asking the federal government for something. And I'm going to tell you, the biggest thing that I expect out of the federal government is for them to do their job and to enforce their laws against their people. Most of the problems that we have in our territory isn't what we're doing to ourselves, and we have some of that, but most of it is the wrong application or the wrongful application of either state or federal laws on our territories. So whether we're talking about tax issues, whether we're talking about crime and punishment, whether we're talking about the various things that the federal government's supposed to do, and I'm going to get into gaming, and it does relate some of what I'm talking about directly to gaming, because I'll tell you one thing about gaming: that is what has created the coffers that have enabled us to spend millions and really I got to say billions of dollars on lawyers and lobbyists. And most of the lobbying that gets done in Washington is related to gaming. So whether it's federal recognition so somebody can do gaming, or whether it's land acquisition for gaming, or whether it's trying to pressure different things that happen at the federal level as it relates to the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. And of course, a lot of our efforts have fallen on deaf ears. The Seneca Nation here has been involved in gaming since 2002. That's George Bush. That's George W. Bush. So there's been George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and now Joe Biden. This will be the fourth administration where there has not been anything adequately done at the federal level to change how IGRA operates. And when I say change, I don't mean rewrite the law. The law is kind of clear. But let me back up on that, as a matter of fact. Because one of the things that people should know is one of the provisions of IGRA was that if a state would not negotiate in good faith with us for a gaming compact, which IGRA requires, I'm not saying we required it, but to operate gaming under the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, it was required that there be a state native gaming compact. Well, if a state doesn't want to do that, in IGRA it said, well, the native territory or the native peoples could sue the state and force them into negotiations. Well, Florida challenged that and they won, and so this whole provision of a federal law creating an avenue for a native territory or native peoples to sue a state was stripped from IGRA, and nothing got put in its place. So the very provision that was supposed to safeguard this notion of bad faith from the states and supposed to prevent that or give us some recourse was taken, and nothing was put back in its place. Nobody ever said, well, if the state won't negotiate a gaming compact, we will set up an office within the Interior Department or the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and you can have enter into a gaming compact with the federal government if that was going to be adequate. No, there was nothing. There were no other provisions put in there. And to make matters worse, not only did that recourse get stripped away, but the willingness of the Interior Department to do its job as it related to revenue sharing is also something that evaporated. Under the terms of IGRA, a state cannot force a native territory to pay revenue to them. They can't tax gaming. Within IGRA, they did say, well, you can enter into a revenue sharing agreement if the state provides a concession to you that has value, a quantifiable value, and you want to pay a value for what the state has conceded to you, then we'll allow that. But it has to be done on a quid pro quo. They're giving you something of value, and you're giving them something of value in return. And if it's not that, then it's a tax, and that's prohibited by the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. And it's the Interior Department who's supposed to enforce that. Not only have they not enforced that, but what the other thing that's happened is the states have said, well, if you're not going to give us revenue for what we're offering you, regardless of its value, we simply won't renegotiate an extension of your gaming compact. We won't have a gaming compact with you. And after 30 years of IGRA, we still don't know today that if a state walks away from a gaming compact, what does that even mean? Does that mean that we're shut down? Does that mean, the states can't shut us down, but does that mean the federal government must shut us down if a state walks away? And I argue that no, they don't, and no, they can't. But we can't get a straight answer out of anybody. And we have had professional white guys asking that question, going back and forth from our territories, or we've flown to Washington to meet with them. We've been doing this for 30 freaking years, and we can't get an answer. So my question is, maybe the problem is the question isn't really adequately being asked. So why pay these people? Why pay for these policy writers and these PR people and these lawyers and consultants and lobbyists if we haven't seen the results? And we haven't seen the results. Look, they convince us to do stupid things like donate campaign funds to both parties. Like, that's not a wash. Hell, when the state of New York was trying to legalize gaming so they could compete directly against us, the lobbyists to the state convinced the Senecas to donate money for their for their vote, for the vote on a constitutional amendment. So when they held their vote for the constitutional amendment, the referendum, the Seneca Nation had donated, I don't know, it was $40,000 or $50,000 to help the state with that campaign to create gaming to compete against us. And so I realize it doesn't make any sense, but why would that happen? Well, because these white people who do this for a living They convinced us that it would buy political will. It would buy goodwill with the state. Good freaking will with the state. So if they have Native people in those positions, if the federal government has Deb Haaland as the Secretary of the Interior and 2 other Native people in high places in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, can't we talk to those Native people ourselves? Do we really need white people that are going to somehow take our message, alter it, and then carry it to them, and then expect it, and then assume that we had a conversation when we didn't? And I'm not saying that we've got to go to Deb Haaland or any of these other people and have a whole conversation to find out where they're coming from. We need to tell them where we're coming from. Look, I've said it before on the show here. Where we're broadcasting from, where we're recording from, is the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. There is nothing legally transferring the title to this land to the United States. Let me say it again. There is no event, there is no document, there is no treaty, there is no negotiation, there is no pursuit of the federal government to say, oh yeah, we want our land to be yours. And I'm saying this, the Senecas never did this. And in fact, none of our territories did that. The Canandaigua Treaty, which I'm not a fan of, and I have to qualify it every time, but it says 3 times in the Canandaigua Treaty that the United States recognizes that our land is ours, and they will never claim the same, nor will they interfere with the free use and enjoyment of our lands, or interfere with our friends and allies who live amongst us. There's a treaty that the federal government negotiated. They added that language. We didn't add that language, and it's mentioned 3 times. I mean, there's only 9 articles of the Canandaigua Treaty, and 3 of them say the same thing: that the United States recognizes that our land is ours, that we own the land, and that the United States will never claim the same. Well, if the United States isn't claiming it, New York State sure as hell isn't claiming it, and nothing since 1794 has changed. There's never been a transfer of title. It just doesn't exist. So is it wrong to tell Deborah Haaland we're not part of the United States? And in fact, I would one up it. I would say at some point, some of the things that have happened on our land should have required State Department approval, not just Interior Department approval. I mean, the big battle over the Thruway, which, of course, the federal courts rejected, was the Seneca Nation saying the state had no authority to enter into any kind of agreement with us without federal involvement. And of course, by federal involvement, they're talking about Interior Department. But I would argue if this land is not part of the United States and it's documented as such, then that requires State Department issues, not just Interior Department involvement. But see, we don't ever have that conversation. We don't have that conversation amongst ourselves, let alone with other Native people. So this is where we have a problem. We have a failure to communicate. Yeah, I know. I borrowed that line. Yeah, there's a failure to communicate here. And the failure is on us. And part of it is we're hiring people to communicate for us. We're hiring lobbying firms and PR firms and, speech writers. We got all of this stuff happening, and we aren't communicating our real feelings on this, our real sentiment on a whole variety of these issues. Look, I'm not a fan of gaming because it turned into a bit of the tail wagging the dog. Oh, no, not a bit. It turned into the tail wagging the dog. But I'll defend our right to do gaming. Part of the reason I'm not a fan of gaming is because of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. It gets touted as if they passed this law that allowed us to do something. It's completely misinterpreted because they passed that law because of a Supreme Court case that happened in California. Again, that had nothing to do with us. It was a small territory in California called the Cabazons that were running a bingo operation that exceeded, what would be considered the high limit, threshold. And the state of California said you couldn't do it. This went through the courts, went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Cabazons and said, look, if the state's doing gaming, they can't tell Native people they can't do gaming. They can regulate their game. You regulate your gaming, they'll regulate their gaming. That's what the Supreme Court said. That was in 1988, either 87 or something like that. The immediate response was that Congress felt like we better do something because they're going to, all of a sudden, Native territories are going to be inundated with gaming, and not just high stakes bingo. They knew that this ruling was going to affect Class 3 gaming. Their immediate concern that they expressed, I'm not saying it was the real concern, but what they said was, we got to make sure that Native people are not taken advantage of by organized crime and by overly aggressive states. Now, so let me clear this up. The Supreme Court didn't give us permission to do gaming. They just acknowledged that we had the right. IGRA didn't give us the permission to do gaming. They just created parameters within federal law that if anything, it benefited vendors. It benefited, financiers. It benefited perhaps our credit rating, because we're no longer operating in a gray zone between what the federal government allows and what it doesn't allow. I mean, you would think the Supreme Court's ruling would have cleared it right up, but because states and federal law still had control over vendors, still had control over lenders, and still had control over various other products and services we would need for a world-class gaming facility. They may not have had control over us, but they had control over them. So part of the reason for Native people to jump headfirst into gaming under the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act had to do with the access, to the rest of the world. Really, it wasn't because we were in love with having to enter into a gaming compact with the state or state of New York or any other state. So it was problematic from the start. But we did it. And you know what? It was profitable. And it was so profitable that we didn't pay attention to how much we were giving away, not only at ridiculous levels when it came to things like interest rates and that kind of stuff. I mean, look, the Seneca Nation now sits in pretty good position. They have a fairly good credit rating. If they needed to borrow money, they could borrow money pretty cheap. But now we're coming back to this conflict because the state's revenue sharing plan said, well, we're going to give you something of value. We're going to give you an exclusivity, which they didn't really give. And in fact, to the extent that they gave an exclusivity, it had no value. And I say that because they couldn't compete against Seneca Nation for gaming directly with Class 3 gaming because it was illegal for New York State to do it. And to the extent that they could compete against us with Class 2, they did. They opened up their racetracks right within the exclusivity zone. And I know I've talked about this on other shows, but I think it's important to recap some of this stuff. So the exclusivity the state offered either didn't exist because the state couldn't do gaming. They can now, but they couldn't do it at the time. And to the extent that they could do gaming that would compete against our territories with Class 2 gaming, they absolutely did. And they still got paid $1.5 billion. And right now, the Seneca Nation, even with a significantly handicapped gaming enterprise that isn't producing enough revenue to even carry their overhead, and I mean the nation's overhead, not the gaming overhead, they're sitting there with $500 million in an account, not knowing if they're going to have to surrender it to the state of New York in a forced revenue sharing provision of their gaming compact. And I say forced, because the view that the Senecas have had, even in a prior conflict over this, was if we don't give them money, they won't renew the compact. So even if it's not ever really said, the sentiment out there, and again, 30 years later, we still can't get clarification from the Interior Department on this. We don't know that if a state walks away from a gaming compact, if that means that a casino has to close. I mean, regardless of the hundreds of millions and millions of dollars of investment that have gone into it, regardless of the significance it plays in the local economy. And by the way, the governor of the state of New York, Andrew Cuomo, oftentimes touts his Buffalo billion, this idea that he was going to sink $1 billion into Western New York for the Western New York economy. Let's be clear. The real Buffalo billion is the $1 billion that he took out of Western New York via Seneca Gaming. Look, you might think, well, yeah, but he took that from the Seneca Nation. Well, where do you think the Seneca Nation was going to spend that $1 billion if it didn't go to the state of New York? They would have sunk it right back in here. They took $1 billion out of the Western New York economy, and they did it through our casinos. I mean, it's insane, but that's the reality. All right, let me get back to what I was originally talking about, which is we need to be able to have this conversation with Deb Haaland, with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and we need to have it directly. We need to have a direct conversation about how we view ourselves, because how the federal government views us, and maybe even how Deb Haaland views us, is anything but reality. But we make it a reality by conceding to this. And the idea that we don't have enough confidence, look, I've talked about our inferiority complex. I've talked about the role of systemic racism. But when you become the victim of this kind of oppression and this kind of racism for so long, you start to believe it. You start to believe that you're inferior, that they are the master race, that those are the people with all the money, and those are the people with all the power, and they are all the people with all the wisdom and all the words and all the laws. And we don't have enough confidence in ourselves to say, I need to communicate with you directly. You need to hear the words coming out of my mouth, not the words coming out of, out of some lobbying firm's mouth. And our issues with the federal government are not legal issues. They're political issues. So in order to advance our politics and our agenda, we need to have diplomacy, not litigation, not lobby. We don't need to lobby for new laws. Most of the existing laws, even the laws that are credited with having some benefit, Indian Child Welfare Act, Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, the Violence Against Women Act. Most of these have provisions that still manage to marginalize us. I mean, part of the reason we have such violence against our women from non-natives is because those charges are never prosecuted, because they're in areas that the police don't want to go. So even though we have in many of our territories courts and police departments or some sort of peacekeeping, marshals in the case here, the federal government's always ignored or refused to acknowledge that we have the right to protect our own territories, that we must rely on them to prosecute. We must rely on them to convict. We must rely on them to serve and protect us. That's not recognizing sovereignty. And this is where that whole word, the difference between what they call tribal sovereignty and what the rest of the world calls sovereignty seem to be miles apart. So we need to have some of these tough conversations, and we need to have them with the people, regardless of whether they're native or not. I'm just saying that if there's native people in those positions, we should at least give them enough benefit of a lot of doubt that they can understand the words coming out of our mouths, and that we don't have to frame it within the context of the systemic racism that goes along with lobbying and the like. We need to have more control over our messaging. I talk a lot about identity here. Our identity is meaningless if we aren't willing to talk about who we are and what we are. And I can't believe that we have become a people who think so poorly of ourselves that we don't think we can communicate directly. I mean, and I know, as we've seen, especially in the last decade or so, as activism has increased over things like the Dakota Access Pipeline, and even Black Lives Matter and some of these social justice issues, we're seeing people being empowered because their voices out of the grassroots community seem to be hitting the target much more accurately than any of the leadership. The leadership, not only do they feel ill-equipped to speak, but they are enlisting somebody else to speak for them. Look, there's no reason that we aren't more transparent with ourselves, with each other, in the community, from leadership down to the grassroots level. And there's no reason that the leadership or those who have been empowered to carry our voices don't actually carry our voices. I mean, part of the thing to say to these elected officials in Washington or Albany is that my people don't accept this. You don't have to say what you accept. You can say my people won't accept this. They won't accept being extorted for another $1 billion from New York State on this fraudulent concept of revenue sharing when the Interior Department is supposed to enforce the restrictions on that. And like I said, it's hard for me to get excited about a Biden administration because there were two terms of Obama Biden when the Seneca Nation was in the throes of a major conflict over revenue sharing, and the Interior Department was a no-show. Now, this is what I will say. My understanding is that Deb Haaland has gaming experience. One of the only jobs or work that she did on behalf of Native people had to do with one of their gaming corporations. And by the accounts that I read, she was successful at it. New Mexico is one of those states that has been extorting revenue sharing out of native gaming operations. So she should know the subject matter. Now, I don't know if she's on the state side of this, which would be really troubling, but we should know that. But we should tell her what our position is and what our expectation is of the Interior Department as it relates to enforcing laws against the states. The very states that they claimed IGRA was concerned about, the aggressive states, the ones who were going to try to take us to the cleaners on our own gaming. Look, the Seneca Nation needs that $500 million more than the state does. I'll say it again. $500 million to the state, they go through that in a couple of days just in Medicare. So that $500 million is huge when it comes to operating the Seneca Nation. And to be clear, there's an absurdity, a whole other issue here associated with the difference between our view and the federal government's view. We don't tax here. We don't charge a tax, and we don't pay income tax to the Seneca Nation and we are constantly fighting, not so much New York State, but we're certainly fighting the federal government. The federal government has another law they want to, that they keep trying to dangle out in front of us. The General Tribal Welfare Exclusion Act. I heard Biden bring this up the other day. Like this was some real gift to us. And this is them saying, well, we're going to allow certain benefits you get from your nation not to be considered taxable. How about none of the stuff we get and we do on our territory should be taxable? Again, remember what I said about our land? There is no place in U.S. history or U.S. law that says we gave that right to them to tax us for the sale of our labor, for our income. How crazy is it that if you sit on Seneca Council, so you're a member of the community, you're a citizen by some definitions of the Seneca Nation, you live on Seneca Nation, you work for your nation and the service of your people, and yet the federal government is entitled to 25 to 30% of your income? We need to have this conversation. And trust me, we haven't had a lobbyist or a lawyer carry that message to Washington or Albany or anyplace else. Look, if there was ever a time to fire lobbyists, it should be now. If for no other reason, and there are many of them, it's because those are Native people. We should be able to talk to them directly. We don't need white people to translate for us. So this is something we need to consider. And as skeptical and cynical as I may be about these Native people who reach these levels of achievement within the federal government system, I think we can at least talk to them. I just don't want to ask them for something. I just need to tell them something. That's my message for the program. Hey, this is our new 30-minute format. We're on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday that we release new audio. So look for us then. Subscribe to our podcast, and you don't need to come to us. We'll come to you. Look forward to having more of these conversations. Thanks for listening. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Yahweh.